When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place for Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. So he asked them again, "Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he, so if you seek me, let these men go." This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken, "Of those whom you gave me, I have lost not one." Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?" So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. This is the word of the Lord.
Is this working? If not, I could use this, I guess. It's okay. We are in the final week of Jesus' life. As told by the gospel writer of John here, it seems to take a really long time. Almost half of the book of John is the final week of his life. You know, John 1, chapter 1, all the way up to John, the end of John chapter 12, is like leading up to the triumphal entry, his final week of his life. And then chapters 13 through 20 is the final week of Jesus' life. And we've been going through the book of John for a little over a year now. Not straight through. We took a break for Christmas and other things. And this actually worked out really well in God's providence that we're going to end on Easter Sunday with John chapter 20 and the resurrection. And by the way, before that, Good Friday, our church has been invited to join in Pastor Ponder's church, which is Michaela's dad's church, for the Good Friday service. So Good Friday at noon, I sent in the email, the address of the church. I'm going to be taking part with some other pastors in the service on Good Friday at noon o'clock. So if you don't have the email, write it on the connection card and tear that off and put it in the offering box that's back on the welcome table so that I can make sure I can send you the address of it. It's in New Kensington. So I don't know if you told him to do that, but Pastor Ponder and I have known each other for a long time. We got together for coffee and things. He's a great guy. Greg did it?
We talked about it last year.
Oh, last year. Okay. I can't do it last year, but I can do it on Good Friday. I'm looking forward to it. So thank you. I'm looking forward. He's a great guy, and he's cool. He said that your church can come over and join our church and some other pastors. So, like I said, Easter Sunday, though, we're going to have a big celebration here. We're going to talk about the resurrection of Jesus Christ like we do every Sunday. But I like what the Lord has done in this organizing the preaching of John, because we're getting a chance now to look at some of these final events in Jesus' life that oftentimes if we just want to preach a sermon on the Palm Sunday, the Triumphal Entry, Good Friday, I end up cramming everything into one sermon. And then I don't do it justice, right? I just run through it too quickly. I avoid some details, and it always feels rushed to me. But this year I'm excited because we get to look at each kind of part little by little, and John himself, he spends time in the final week that other gospel writers don't necessarily hit. So even today, we're not going to have time to get into everything because John does skip some things that the other gospel writers leave out, and he includes some things that the other gospel writers don't include. So it's really neat when you look at all of the four narratives of what happened in the final hours of Jesus' life, and you kind of put those together and see what happened. But here in John chapter 18, the main event here is Jesus' arrest. And the big idea is that Jesus orchestrates his own betrayal and arrest, proving that he is Lord over every situation. Jesus is orchestrating his own betrayal and his own arrest, proving that he is Lord over every situation. So Jesus has had his final meal with his disciples. John chapter 13 began with him washing all 12 disciples' feet. And these are the men that's been with him the longest. They know him better than anybody else. He knows them. They know him. They've traveled with him. They've given up everything to be with Jesus, to learn from him, to follow him, to be his disciples. But as Jesus said in that final meal, you're not just my students, you're my friends. There was a tight relationship there. And they have been with him for 3 years. They've been with him through the ups and the downs of life's ministry. They have literally been with him through some storms. And through it all, Jesus loves them, showed his love for them. And so at that final meal, he washed their feet and he humbled himself. And during that meal, he said, if you remember, that one of them was going to betray him. And all of them knew that the religious authorities were after Jesus during this holiday season in this city there. Remember, if some of the disciples didn't even want to go to the city. They're like, everybody's looking for you. They got spies everywhere. You can't even go there. We're all going to be arrested. Fine. We'll just go. You know what I mean? Remember, one of them just threw up their hands and said, we're all going to get it. So let's just go. So they all go to the city. And it was during this time, they're all looking for Jesus, that Jesus has this meal. And he's with his disciples in the upper room. And in the city, it's a Passover celebration. So there's hundreds of thousands of people in the city of Jerusalem at this time who, some people are looking for Jesus. And it explains why sometimes we picture the Last Supper as that Jesus is all by himself and stuff. But remember, this city was busting at the seams during this holiday season. And so it came as a shock that at the meal, that the disciples heard the announcement from Jesus that one of them was going to betray him. And the disciples all looked around and wondered who it could be. And no one could guess who will betray Jesus or how a person could go about doing such a thing. And even during the meal, when Jesus said, somebody said, who's going to betray you? And he said, it's this person, the one I handle the morsel of food to. And he hands it to Judas and says, go and do what you have gone to do. So even after he gets up and leaves the table, the other people who didn't hear that conversation thought that Judas was going to go do some administrative tasks, that he was going to go give money to the poor. That's what they thought. Even after he left the table, they never imagined that Judas was going to go betray them. They thought he was going to go do some kind of, they never thought he was going to go rat him out. They didn't know that Judas had already given himself up to the work of Satan and that he was on his way to committing the worst act of evil imaginable, betrayal. To betray someone. To betray someone is, some people say, it's the worst sin imaginable. Like Dante's book or whatever about hell, Dante's Inferno, written in like 1100 or so, treachery, betrayal, was worse than murder. Like that was more punishment in his fiction book. That was worse punishment than anything else, because betrayal is something that strikes at the heart of a person. I think the best picture illustration of this, if you've ever seen the movie Braveheart, I know it's an old movie, you know what I'm saying? But remember, it was about the independence of Scotland, and William Wallace was fighting for the independence, and he had told this guy, Robert the Bruce, if you just lead the people, they will lead you. But Robert the Bruce ended up saying, you know what, if I just go with the King of England, I'm going to get more land, and I don't have to worry about my people, Scotland. And it was at the very end of the movie, kind of, whenever William Wallace got on the field of battle and was going after the king, and then he faced this enemy, this masked knight who had his face covered, and they clashed together. And then right when William Wallace ripped off the guy's mask and was getting ready to kill him, he saw that it was Robert the Bruce, and he just fell back and he just he couldn't breathe, and his face just had a blank stare, because it was not only is this was the guy, not only is this guy attacking you when you're trying to fight for freedom for your people, but not only that, this is the guy that you tried to say, they're your people. If you will only lead them, they will follow. I mean, this is the guy that you trusted. This is the person you put all of your hopes and dreams in. This is the person that, your closest friend. Betrayal is not only the hurt that comes with that, but it's someone that you trusted. Someone that the best picture is getting stabbed in the back. Betrayal is when you get stabbed in the back by someone, but it's by someone that you care about, by someone that you love. Maybe this has happened to you. Maybe you've done this to another person. It could happen unintentionally. An act of disloyalty, infidelity, dishonesty, or accidentally saying something you didn't mean to say. And whether or not you have done it on purpose, the result is the same. The victim is hurt. And not only hurt, but also shocked. According to the National Institute for Health, the effects of betrayal include shock, loss and grief, damaged self-esteem, self-doubting, and anger. And so it's hard to describe it. There's just so many emotions that go together with this act of betrayal. And no doubt there were a lot of emotions going on inside Jesus on the night that he was betrayed and arrested. But I can guarantee you that surprise was not one of them for Jesus, because Jesus orchestrated how this night would unfold. He knew it was coming. He came to this earth to die for sinners. He came to give his life as a ransom for many. But the way it was done, the pain involved, we have to ask ourselves, why? Why go about this way? Why do it like this? I think he did it for us. He did it for you and me. He knows the pain that you've gone through. He's felt it all and then some. So let's take a look at this meeting place in John chapter 18. Before they get there, dinner is over. It says that dinner ended and Judas is gone. So the 11 of them, they sing a song together. They sing a hymn and then they go out. And the night is late and it's dark out. But there's a full moon on this spring evening. And Jesus leads his 11 disciples out of the city, down the hill, away from the city, across the brook Kidron, and up the hill known as the Mount of Olives. You see, a lot of people were in the city for this Passover celebration. And so we imagine that people were probably just camping everywhere, all over the place. And the place where Jesus normally stayed whenever he was in the city of Jerusalem was with his friends, Lazarus' sisters and Lazarus, just 8 or 10 miles away in the town of Bethany. But that was too far away. He couldn't go there or he would be breaking the Sabbath rules. And so he didn't go out to Bethany during the Passover celebration to spend the night there. Instead, he exited the city, still within the limits that was required by the Passover rules. And thankfully, there was somebody who had this walled garden, a semi-private garden known as Gethsemane. And this is where Jesus would have camped with his disciples. It's where he would have spent the night. What's interesting, it says that he had to cross the brook Kidron to get there. They went down the hill, across the brook, and then up the hill on the other side to the walled-in garden. Now, it was called a brook, but it wasn't really a brook like a constantly running stream like we think of. Like, when we think of the streams around here, the rivers around here. Instead, it was called a wadi. It was like a dry gulch. It was like a dry riverbed for most of the season. But in the spring, when it rained a lot, then it could be a gushing water. That's why they could easily cross it. But what's interesting, it was just outside the temple wall. Well, what happens in the temple area is the sacrifice of animals. And so I've always wondered too, was there a lot of blood with all the sacrifices that took place in the temple? And if there was a lot of blood, some commentators speculate that that blood would have literally ran down this brook, if you will, mixed with water. And so imagine the picture there that Jesus crosses that bloody stream of water to go to the Garden of Gethsemane that night. And he goes to the garden there, and John doesn't record it, but this is where Jesus prayed strenuously to the Father. And it's where Jesus asked his disciples to pray with him, to keep watch. He said, just for an hour, just stay up with me and pray with me this night. And if you remember, they kept falling asleep, and he would wake them up. And he knew what was about to take place, and he was under so much stress. It said that Jesus sweat drops of blood. And he was under so much stress that the angels had to come and strengthen him because of what is about to take place. And the action picks up in verse 2 in the garden here. It says, now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew this place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So it was in the middle of this spring night. Like I said, it was probably cloudless because in verse 18 it says it was a cold night. And those ancient olive trees, they cast this eerie shadows throughout the garden. And by the way, we know it was a full moon because it was Passover, which always takes place on the full moon. So we know the light was out there. And beyond the ravine, they could see the scattered lights of Jerusalem across the brook. They could see the lights of Jerusalem. And through the darkness, Jesus and his disciples see a great crowd coming out toward them with torches and lanterns and weapons. A Roman band of soldiers, it says in verse 3. Now, it might say cohort in your versions of the Bible. I don't think it was a full cohort. I don't think it was a full 1,000 people. But a lot of people speculate it was probably a couple hundred Roman soldiers, maybe a few hundred, along with police officers from the temple, some religious leaders. They're all coming out with weapons and torches. And who is that that's in the very front? Who is that that's leading them? It's Judas. And that's how they knew where to find him. They weren't scattered all over the mountainside looking for him. They were making a beeline for the garden. Judas knew that that's where Jesus was going after dinner that night, because that's where he always went. And Judas was one of them. How could he do that? How could he betray the one he loved? And to make things worse, the other gospel writers record that Judas was going to point out who Jesus was to the authorities by giving him a kiss. And it's like, come on, Judas, why don't you just point at him? Why don't you just say, that's him right there? Why do you have to choose an act of love to do something so hateful? It was the ultimate act of stabbing somebody in the back. And Judas is the one who did it. John's last mention of Judas in the book, you know, what happened to Judas is he did this because he got paid off. 30 pieces of silver. He wanted the money. And he had already been helping himself to the purse anyway. The corporate, money, he was taking some for himself. And that greed got a hold of him. He wanted more money. And so he betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Later, in other gospel writers, we learn that he ends up committing suicide because he realizes what he had done. But John's last mention of Judas in the book of John is in verse 5. It says, and Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. He was standing with Jesus' enemies. He was not standing with the 11. The 11 were at risk of being arrested because they were standing with Jesus. But Judas was at a greater risk because he was at eternal risk of his soul. To stand with the world is to stand against the Lord Jesus and to put your soul at risk. And to stand with Jesus against the world is actually the place of security. So we should learn from Judas to make sure that our faith is not in external obedience only, and appearances only, but it's a matter of our hearts. Because it's easy to fake out other people sometimes. Remember at the dinner, they didn't even suspect it would have been Judas. Even after he left, they never even thought, it just blows my mind, they never even thought that it was Judas. When Jesus said somebody's going to betray me, Judas leaves the table. Oh, it can't be him. What a great reputation he must have had. Oh, it could never have been him. It could have been anybody at the table. And we know that Satan, it says in John, that Judas had already given himself over to what he was about to do. And so I pray that we would pray the prayer of the psalmist in Psalms 139, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts, and see if there be any hurtful way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. And so you're probably wondering, why was it such a large crowd of soldiers coming out to arrest Jesus? Which is just quite the contrast, don't you think? It would be like the modern day equivalent of like a peaceful religious leader who had done no violence or called anybody to violence, like somebody sending a SWAT team to arrest them. I mean, I actually saw that in the news recently. Why would you send a SWAT team to arrest somebody? And in fact, Jesus said, another writer, he said, I've been standing in the temple all week long. Monday, Tuesday, were you guys busy? Why would you send a SWAT team in the middle of the night to come arrest me? Why did they do that? Maybe they thought, everybody loves you. Maybe like this zealous mob is going to be, whipped up. Maybe they were worried about that. And they would, people would try to fight back. Or maybe they thought Jesus was going to make a run for it into the mountains and try to escape and hide. But none of that happened, right? None of that happened. Why did that not happen? Because Jesus was totally in control the whole time. And now we see that confrontation playing out in verse 4. Jesus knows that they are coming. Actually, he knew they were coming before they knew they were coming. He doesn't hide. He doesn't run away. He doesn't even actually stay exactly where he's at. He goes out to meet the crowd. And he asks them the question, "Whom do you seek?" He initiates the confrontation with this question, "Who are you looking for?" And I can think of a few reasons why he did this. First of all, he wanted them to come right out with it. I mean, if you're going to do something like this, an unjust deed, then don't beat around the bush. Just say it out loud if you've got the guts to do it. And they respond by saying, "Jesus of Nazareth," as if he's like some ordinary Joe Schmo, right? From some backward, low-culture community. We're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. They didn't say, "Jesus, the one who's been teaching in the temple for the whole week. Jesus, the miracle worker who gives sight to the blind and makes the lame walk. Jesus, the rabbi who's the teacher that's very well known. Jesus, the one who claims to be the Son of Man, who's God in the flesh." They could have said any of those things, and they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And I think Jesus also gets them to say who it is, like, state your case, because they're not like carrying a warrant with them, right? So I think he wants them to say they are looking for him, because the mob, the soldiers could have easily been justified in arresting all 11 disciples. And I bet the disciples were afraid of this very thing. But he got them to say they're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus responds in verse 5 by saying, "I am he," that's how it's written in our English Bibles. And John mentions these "I am" statements. We call them the "I am" statements of John. And what he says, "I am he," it's the culmination of 2 sets of 7 instances where John has used this phrase, "I am," followed by a claim by Jesus of his deity and who he is. Remember, John was written so that you may believe that he is the Son of God, and by believing you may have life in his name. So when John writes that Jesus says, "I am such and such," he's revealing who he is. He's calling us to believe in him. That specific statement that Jesus made, in the Greek, it's ego eimi. And I say that because, we have an English translation of the Greek New Testament that I'm preaching from today. Like, mine's in English. I'm not smart enough to, there are some preachers who can look at the Greek and preach in English. I can't do that. But, they had a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And so the Hebrew Old Testament, which in modern English translators, they go back to the original Hebrew language to translate it from Hebrew to English. Well, they had a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. And when Jesus said this phrase, this Greek phrase, this is what in the Hebrew Bible was the translation into Greek from the Hebrew word from Exodus chapter 3 of when Moses was talking to God, and God said, go tell Pharaoh to let my people go. And Moses is like, who should I say is your name? Like, who should I say sent me? And God said, say, "I am who I am." I am. And we don't even have an English word for the Hebrew word that the Lord told Moses to tell Pharaoh. We say the Lord. And in English, we say Yahweh. We don't even know how it was written, honestly. We just guess. Because they never wrote it down, and they never really said it. But it was Jesus, it was the Lord's revelation of himself, his covenant promise to his people. So the covenant, the personal name of our God is the Lord. And I say the Lord because I don't know exactly how to say it. But in Greek, it was ego eimi. And that's the name that Jesus said. He didn't just say, "I am he." He said, "I am." And it says right after that all of those soldiers, it says, withdrew or fell back. And so you have all these "I am" statements that Jesus had already made. I am the good shepherd. I am the light of the world. And now he says, "I am." When they asked he says, "Who are you looking for?" And they said, "Jesus." Now he said, "I am." They drew back and fell to the ground. Now, the word drew back could be like drew back, retreated, stepped backward. But how do you even picture this, right? How do you picture several hundred soldiers with torches and weapons falling down like bowling pins? Like, that's how I picture it. I don't think they just took a step back, because it says they fell to the ground for no reason except that Jesus announced who he was. Did he yell it? Even if he did, his voice wasn't going to be enough to scare those soldiers, right? Was there a momentary, miraculous flash of glory like that knocked Paul to the ground when he was on the road to Damascus? I don't know exactly what it looked like, but I think it's pretty funny, if you ask me, that hundreds of soldiers coming out to arrest an unarmed man, and they can't even stand before him. Obviously, if Jesus wanted to call down 10,000 angels, he could have easily done that. Just by 2 words, they all fell backward. Earlier Jesus said, I lay down my life that I might take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down on my own accord. I have the authority to lay it down, and I have the authority to take it up again. So this scene leaves us wondering, who's arresting who here? Right? Clearly, Jesus is in control of this whole situation. And so they gather themselves together. The soldiers stand up again, brush themselves off, probably make a few excuses. Be like, oh, I didn't fall down. No. What was that? Why'd you run into me? Why'd you run into me, And again, they approach Jesus. And again, they ask him this situation. They ask him the question. And Jesus says, who are you looking for? Maybe you didn't hear me the first time. Are you guys having a little trouble? I asked you who you're looking for. And like I said, I can imagine that if the soldiers were coming forward, that they probably, first of all, they thought they were really tough guys. And Jesus said, who are you looking for? And they were like, Jesus of Nazareth. They probably said it with a lot of force and gusto. And then they get knocked off their feet. And so Jesus is like, guys, come here. Who are you looking for? And this time I bet they're like, Jesus of Nazareth? That's what I thought. That's what I thought. I told you that I am he. So if you're looking for me, then let these people go. And I think the soldiers were going to let him go. I don't think they were messing around anymore. Because one of the reasons why Jesus forced them to announce who they were looking for is because it was Jesus' way of protecting his own, of looking out for them. They were worried they were going to get arrested. They could have easily been arrested if the soldiers were in control, but Jesus is in control. And so in verse 9 it says, this was to fulfill the word that he had spoken, of those whom you gave me, I have lost not one. So John starts to say that Jesus' words from dinner, it's like Hebrew scriptures written down, that Jesus' own prophecy from only a few hours earlier is being fulfilled right here before our very eyes. Because Christ protects his followers. Christ protects his followers. Martin Luther believed that this protection here was the greatest miracle that happened in the scene of Gethsemane here. Because it showed that Christ was able to protect his followers physically, but more important, he can protect us spiritually as well. And so the story could have ended right there with them taking Jesus into custody and the disciples walking away dejected. But that's not what happened. Instead, we get this Peter's impulsive and impetuous action. Read with me in verse 10 here. It says this, then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. And the writer of Luke includes the detail that Peter, it says that he said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And then before waiting for an answer, he grabs his sword and hits somebody in the head. And you got to love Peter, right? Big heart, little brain. Does he really think he's going to defeat a Roman cohort of soldiers with a little tiny sword? And honestly, it wasn't a real sword. Probably. It probably wasn't like a soldier's sword. A Roman short sword was called a gladius, and it was about 24 to 33 inches long. And it was mainly used, I've seen a picture of it, it's mainly used for stabbing. So you see, Peter didn't even know how to use the sword right. Swords are made for different things. I don't know if you've noticed this or not. Like I was showing the kids, when I was in Haiti, I got a machete, and I was showing them that this is not for stabbing. I have a cousin who was playing around with a machete, and he stabbed a hay bale. Well, there's no hilt on a machete. So if you stab it, his hand slid off the handle, and he cut it on the blade. A machete is used for swinging, okay? So there are swords that are used for swinging. There are swords that are used for stabbing. And what Peter was carrying was used for stabbing, not for swinging. But you can't really blame him. He's a fisherman. He's not a soldier. But in his gusto, he swings at the servant's head and cuts off a guy's right ear. Poor Malchus. And what does Jesus say? Knock it off. At least that's my interpretation. In Luke, it says that he says, no more of this. And then he touches the man's ear and heals him. So not only is our Lord powerful and gracious, but he is merciful even in his last moments. And Peter thinks he is doing right, but once again, he is put in his place by Jesus. Just like earlier when Jesus was talking about his upcoming death, and Peter said, I'm not going to let that happen to you. And Jesus said, get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are setting your mind on the things of God, not on the things of God, but on the things of man. You see, the things of man are about power and protecting what is mine, but the things of God are about humiliating yourself to do God's will. And so finally, I just want to note the conclusion here. This final conclusion of the Lord's majestic statement here in the final verse, verse 11. He said, put your sword in its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given to me? He said, put your sword away, Peter. This isn't about fighting. God's kingdom does not come about with force. It doesn't come about through the sword. He said, shall I not drink the cup the Father has given to me? The cup was the cross, the cup of judgment that we should have drunk. Jesus drank the cup of God's wrath for us so that he could extend the cup of God's fellowship to us, the cup of life, the cup of glory. And Jesus did not run from being betrayed. For our sakes, he embraced it. He waited for it. He pursued it. He was betrayed so that you might be eternally accepted in the beloved. So if you've been betrayed by people, remember that he was betrayed for you, that you might be accepted by him. Jesus willingly went to the cross. But before that, Jesus willingly and willfully orchestrated his own betrayal by a good friend and his own arrest. You know, it says in verse 12 that I had verse 12 be read too, because if you look at it, it says that they bound Jesus and they took him away. You know, he said those two words. When they said, who are you looking for? He said, I am, right? And they all fell down. So what makes them think that some ropes are going to hold Jesus? No, it wasn't the soldiers. It wasn't the handcuffs that were holding Jesus at his arrest. Just like it wasn't the nails that held Jesus to the cross. It was his love for you and me.